What happens when a president says he has the power to do something, and then the courts say, not so fast? That is exactly what happened in a remarkable series of rulings surrounding the Trump administration. Within roughly the same news cycle, federal courts delivered decisions touching two completely different parts of Trump's agenda. One ruling dealt with Trump's massive White House ballroom project. Another set of rulings dealt with the administration's effort to end temporary protected status for migrants from South Sudan and Myanmar. And the most interesting part isn't simply whether Trump won or lost, it's what these rulings reveal about the limits of presidential power and about how complicated the American judicial system has become. Because here's the part that could surprise you. Even judges appointed by Trump don't automatically rule for Trump. And one of the clearest examples came from the White House itself. So what exactly happened? Why did the judges split? And what could these decisions mean for Trump's administration going forward? Let's break it down. Let's start with the ruling that immediately grabbed national attention. Trump's administration has been pursuing a massive ballroom project at the White House. The proposed facility is roughly 90,000 square feet, with the administration putting its cost at around $400 million. But the project has faced a major legal challenge over whether the president has the authority to make such a substantial change to the White House grounds without congressional authorization. And on August 7th, a three-judge panel of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit delivered a major setback to the administration. The court ruled one to uphold an injunction stopping above-ground construction. The majority concluded that Congress had a role to play in authorizing such a major project. In other words, the White House couldn't simply say, "We're doing this," and assume the legal argument was over. The court said the constitutional and statutory questions mattered. And that distinction is enormous, because this wasn't simply a dispute about architecture. It became a dispute about executive power. How much authority does a president have to transform government property? And where does congressional authority begin? That is the real battle underneath the ballroom controversy. Here's where the story gets particularly interesting. The ruling wasn't unanimous. Two judges voted against the administration, but one judge dissented. And that judge was Naomi Rao, a Trump appointee. That matters because it destroys one of the simplest narratives surrounding judicial politics, that a judge appointed by a Republican president will automatically side with that president. That isn't how the federal judiciary is supposed to work. Judges have lifetime appointments, and once they're on the bench, they don't technically serve as representatives of the president who nominated them. Their job is to interpret the law. That doesn't mean judges are completely free from ideological differences. Of course they're not. Judges have legal philosophies. They have different approaches to executive power. They have different views about statutory interpretation. But judicial independence means the White House does not get to dictate the outcome. And the ballroom case demonstrated that perfectly. The majority rejected Trump's position, but a Trump-appointed judge rejected the majority's reasoning and sided with the administration. That creates a much more complicated picture than simply saying Trump judges versus anti-Trump judges, because the real fight is over what the law permits. Now think about the broader implication. Every president wants flexibility. Every administration wants to move quickly, and every president eventually runs into the same constitutional question. Where does executive authority stop? Trump has repeatedly pushed an expansive vision of presidential power. Supporters argue that voters elected the president to act decisively. Critics argue that presidential power still has boundaries. The Constitution divides federal authority among three branches. The president executes the laws, Congress makes the laws, and courts interpret the law and resolve disputes. The ballroom fight became a physical representation of that constitutional tension. The administration argued that the project served important governmental and security purposes. Opponents argued that major changes to the White House complex required congressional involvement. The appellate court ultimately sided with the latter position, and that is why this case is bigger than one building. Because if a president can make major changes to government property without Congress, critics argue, where does that authority stop? And if Congress can block virtually every major presidential initiative, where does executive authority stop? That's the constitutional balancing act at the heart of this case. Trump was obviously not happy with the ruling. The president criticized the decision and indicated that his administration would continue fighting. And that means this isn't necessarily the end. The administration can seek Supreme Court review. So the appellate court decision may ultimately become another chapter in a much larger legal battle. But there is an important distinction viewers need to understand. A court ruling against a president does not mean the president has been removed from power. It doesn't mean the entire administration has collapsed. And it doesn't automatically mean the court has permanently killed the policy. It means that, at this stage of the litigation, the court has placed a legal barrier in the government's way. That barrier can potentially be challenged through appeals. And that is exactly why these cases can take months or even years. Now, here's where the story gets even more complicated. While Trump's ballroom project was facing a major legal setback, federal judges elsewhere were delivering decisions that went in the opposite direction. Two federal judges ruled on August 7th that the Trump administration could move forward with ending temporary protected status, or TPS, for nationals of South Sudan and Myanmar. According to reporting, the decisions affected roughly 232 South Sudanese nationals and about 4,000 people from Myanmar. TPS is a humanitarian immigration program. It allows eligible nationals of designated countries to remain temporarily in the United States and obtain work authorization when conditions in their home countries make return unsafe. The Trump administration has been moving to terminate TPS protections for several countries. Immigrant rights organizations challenged those moves. But the latest rulings cleared the way for the administration to proceed with the South Sudan and Myanmar terminations. And that is where the phrase back-to-back rulings becomes important. Because within a very short period of time, the courts were doing something that may seem contradictory at first glance. One court was stopping an important Trump administration initiative. Other courts were allowing another Trump administration initiative to proceed. This is where political commentary often becomes misleading. You will hear people say, these are Trump's judges, or these are anti-Trump judges. But the reality is much more complicated. Federal judges aren't supposed to vote as members of a political party, and their appointment history doesn't automatically tell you how every case will turn out. The ballroom decision is a perfect example. A Trump-appointed judge dissented. Meanwhile, the majority ruled against Trump's position. At the same time, other judges allowed Trump's administration to proceed with immigration policy changes. So instead of one unified judicial front, what we're actually seeing is a patchwork of legal decisions. Different judges, different statutes, different facts, different legal questions, different interpretations, and eventually potentially different appeals. That's the judicial system working through competing arguments. And this brings us to the most important part, the Supreme Court. The lower federal courts aren't always the final word. In many of these disputes, the government can appeal, and the Supreme Court can decide whether to hear a case. That makes the Supreme Court especially important during Trump's second term. The administration has already faced numerous legal challenges involving immigration, executive power, federal spending, civil rights, and presidential authority. And the Supreme Court has sometimes limited lower courts' ability to issue nationwide injunctions. That matters because the legal battlefield isn't simply Trump versus one judge. It's a chain: district court, appeals court, and potentially the Supreme Court. Each level can change the outcome. That's why a dramatic headline about a single court ruling can sometimes be misleading. A ruling can be important without being final. Now, step back. What do these cases tell us about Trump's presidency? The biggest story may be the sheer number of legal battles surrounding executive action. Trump has pursued an aggressive agenda: immigration, government restructuring, executive authority, federal spending, regulation, and even changes to the physical White House complex. Each major move can create a legal question, and each legal question can create a lawsuit. That's when the courts become a critical check on presidential power. Supporters of Trump argue that unelected judges shouldn't be able to stop an elected president from carrying out his agenda. Opponents argue that elections don't give presidents unlimited authority. Both arguments touch on a real constitutional principle. The president has significant powers, but those powers aren't unlimited, and Congress has powers too, and courts have a role too. The entire system depends on those branches operating within their constitutional boundaries. Here's perhaps the most important detail of all. A judge ruling against Trump does not necessarily mean that judge is anti-Trump. And a judge ruling for Trump doesn't necessarily mean that judge is Trump's political ally. That distinction is incredibly important. Judges can agree with an administration on one legal question and disagree on another. They can support one executive action while rejecting another. They can interpret one statute differently from another. And judges appointed by the same president can disagree with each other. That's exactly why the ballroom ruling is so revealing. The panel itself demonstrated disagreement. Two judges reached one conclusion, a Trump-appointed judge reached another. That's not necessarily evidence that the judiciary is broken. It's evidence that the legal questions are contested, and ultimately, that's what courts are designed to resolve. So what happens now? First, Trump's ballroom project faces a major legal obstacle. The administration has indicated that it intends to continue fighting the decision. That means the Supreme Court could eventually become involved. Second, the immigration cases continue to develop. The decisions involving South Sudan and Myanmar allow the administration to proceed with ending TPS protections, but broader legal challenges surrounding the administration's immigration policies remain active. And third, the larger constitutional fight isn't going away. The central question remains, how much power should a president have? And how aggressively should courts intervene when presidential actions are challenged? That debate will continue far beyond this week's headlines, because this isn't really about one ballroom, and it isn't only about immigration, it's about the boundaries of presidential power. And that's why these back-to-back rulings are worth paying attention to. One court said, essentially, the president cannot simply act without congressional authority when the law requires Congress to be involved. Other judges said the administration could proceed with major immigration changes after considering the legal arguments before them. And perhaps the biggest lesson is this: don't assume the American judiciary operates like another political branch. Judges can disagree. Panels can split. Trump-appointed judges can rule against Trump, and judges appointed by Democratic presidents can sometimes rule for Republican administrations. That's what makes the legal system unpredictable. And that's also why the next stage of these cases could be even more important than the rulings we just saw. Because the question isn't simply whether Trump wins or loses one court battle. The question is, where exactly are the legal limits of presidential power in 2026? And as these cases move through the appeals process, we're about to find out. If you think the courts are becoming one of the most important battlegrounds of Trump's second term, let me know what you think in the comments. And for more fact-based political analysis and major legal developments, subscribe and stay tuned.